A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was holding its breath, which was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Because in all the years Selina Ashwood had lived in these woods, alone and forgotten by the world that had cast her out, she had learned that nature never truly went silent unless death was walking nearby. The usual symphony of evening sounds that normally accompanied the transition from day to night. The rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. The distant calls of hunting owls. The whisper of wind through pine needles. All of it had ceased entirely, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt almost supernatural, as though the forest itself was waiting for something momentous to happen. Something that would change the very fabric of the world as she knew it. Celine paused on the narrow game trail that led back to her cabin, her worn leather boots planted firmly in the carpet of fallen leaves that covered the forest floor. And she felt the weight of that unnatural silence pressing against her skin like a physical thing, raising goosebumps along her arms despite the thick wool sweater she wore against the autumn chill that had been growing steadily colder as winter approached with relentless inevitability. The 2 rabbits she'd caught in her snare traps hung from her belt, their small bodies still warm, representing tonight's dinner and possibly tomorrow's breakfast if she was careful with her portions, and she should have been pleased with the successful hunt, should have been hurrying back to her cabin before the last light faded completely and the temperature dropped even further. But instead, she found herself frozen in place. Every instinct she'd developed over 4 years of solitary survival screaming that something was wrong, that the forest's silence meant predators, and predators meant danger of a kind that a lone Omega with nothing but a hunting knife and hard-won survival skills would be foolish to confront. She'd learned to trust her instincts in the years since the Ashwood pack had given her the choice between ritual humiliation and permanent exile, had learned that her gut feelings about danger were usually correct, had survived this long precisely because she knew when to be cautious and when to run. And right now, every fiber of her being was telling her to get back to her cabin, bar the door, and wait out whatever was happening in the forest around her. But then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through the trees. A whimpering that was weak and desperate and filled with a pain so profound it made her chest tighten with sympathetic anguish, even though she had no idea what creature was making that terrible sound. It came again, slightly louder this time, and Celine felt her body moving before her mind had fully processed the decision to investigate. Her feet carrying her off the familiar trail and into the dense undergrowth that bordered the path, pushing through brambles that caught at her clothes and pulled at her long silver hair, which hung loose around her shoulders and down her back, gleaming even in the fading light with that strange metallic sheen that had marked her as different from the moment of her birth, that had caused the elders of her pack to whisper about omens and curses, that had ultimately contributed to her exile when her first mate had died under suspicious circumstances and the pack had needed someone to blame for their collective failure to protect one of their own. The whimpering grew louder as she pushed deeper into the undergrowth, and Celine's healer heart, the part of her that had been carefully nurtured by her grandmother before the old woman had passed away and left her truly alone in a pack that had never wanted her, overrode every single survival instinct that was screaming at her to turn back, to leave whatever was hurt out here to its fate, to remember that she was alone and vulnerable and had no pack to protect her if she encountered something dangerous. She'd been alone for so long now, 4 years of living in a cabin so remote that she sometimes went months without seeing another living soul. 4 years of talking to herself just to remember what her own voice sounded like. 4 years of convincing herself that isolation was safety, that being alone meant no one else could get hurt because of her supposed curse. But the truth was, that loneliness had carved out a hollow space inside her chest that ached with every breath. And sometimes she wondered if survival without connection, without purpose, without anyone to care whether she lived or died, was really living at all, or just a slower, more painful form of death. The undergrowth opened suddenly into a small clearing, and Celine stopped so abruptly she nearly fell, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scene before her with wide eyes that reflected the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy above. There was a wolf collapsed in the center of the clearing, and even in her shock, even with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, Celine's experienced eye immediately cataloged the details that would determine whether this creature lived or died in the next few hours. The wolf was massive, easily the largest she had ever seen in her 26 years of life, with a body that had to be at least 6 feet long from nose to tail, and probably weighed close to 300 pounds of solid muscle and bone, and its fur was the color of fresh snow touched with silver, a shade so rare and beautiful that Celine felt her breath catch for an entirely different reason, because she had only ever seen one other wolf with fur that particular shade, and that was herself when she shifted into her wolf form, something she hadn't done in years because shifting alone, without a pack to run with, had felt too painful, too much like a reminder of everything she had lost. The silver-white fur was matted with blood, dark and glistening wet in the fading light, and Celine could see deep gashes across the wolf's shoulder and flank, claw marks that could only have come from something large and powerful, probably a bear judging by the width and depth of the wounds, and there was a puncture wound in the hind leg that looked infected already, the flesh around it hot and swollen, indicating that this injury had happened hours ago, maybe even a full day, and the wolf had been struggling to survive ever since. The creature's breathing was labored and shallow, each breath a visible effort that made its entire body shudder, and when it opened its eyes to look at her, Celine felt something shift deep inside her chest, some instinctive recognition that she didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore, because those eyes were the most extraordinary shade of ice blue she had ever seen, pale and clear and filled with an intelligence that no ordinary wolf possessed, which meant this was a shifter, someone who could take human form, someone who belonged to a pack somewhere, someone who had family waiting for them, someone who mattered to other people in ways that Celine hadn't mattered to anyone in so very long. She should leave, should turn around, and go back to her cabin and pretend she had never seen this wolf, because getting involved with pack politics or pack business was dangerous for a rogue Omega with no protection and no connections, and if this wolf died despite her help, if her supposed curse struck again and took another life, she would have proof that everyone had been right about her, that she was touched by misfortune, that she brought death to those around her simply by existing. The rational part of her mind was listing all these reasons with perfect clarity, enumerating every single danger and every possible negative outcome, building a logical case for why she should walk away right now and leave this magnificent creature to whatever fate the moon goddess had decreed for it. But even as those thoughts raced through her mind, Celine found herself moving forward, dropping to her knees beside the dying wolf, her hands already reaching out to assess the damage, to catalog the injuries, to calculate what she would need to save this life, even though saving it might cost her everything. "I'm going to help you," she heard herself saying, her voice rough from disuse because she so rarely spoke aloud anymore, having no one to talk to except herself, and occasionally the birds that visited the clearing around her cabin, and the wolf's eyes tracked her movement, watching her with that unsettling intelligence as she carefully examined the worst of the wounds without touching them yet, not wanting to cause additional pain, before she had supplies to actually treat the injuries properly. "You're someone's son, someone's pack member, maybe someone's mate or father or brother, and I will not let you die out here alone in the cold when I have the knowledge and the skill to possibly save you. Even if saving you proves once and for all that I'm cursed, even if you die anyway, and I have to live with one more death on my conscience, because I've already lost so much, already given up so much, already sacrificed every connection and every relationship I ever had, and the one thing I will not sacrifice, the one thing I will not let them take from me, is my ability to care about suffering when I see it, my inability to walk away from pain when I have the power to ease it, even if that power is limited, even if my help isn't enough." The wolf made a soft sound, something between a whimper and a chuff, and Celine chose to interpret it as agreement, as permission, as acceptance of her offer to help, and she was already standing up, already calculating how long it would take her to run back to her cabin and gather the supplies she would need. "Stay here," she commanded, as though the wolf had any choice in the matter given its condition, as though it could somehow get up and wander away when it was clearly on the verge of death. And then she was running, her feet finding the path back through the undergrowth with the sure knowledge of someone who had walked these woods for years, who knew every tree and every stone, who could navigate by instinct even as the light failed and darkness began to fall in earnest around her. Her cabin appeared ahead, small and humble and drafty, but hers, the only home she had known for 4 years, and she burst through the door, already reaching for her healing kit, the leather satchel she had carefully stocked with herbs and salves and bandages, the knowledge her grandmother had passed down to her before dying and leaving her alone in a pack that had never wanted the strange, silver-haired child who looked like a ghost, like an omen, like something that didn't quite belong in the natural world. She grabbed clean water and blankets and her sharpest knife for cutting away matted fur, and she was racing back into the darkening forest, following the path she had just taken, praying to the moon goddess that the wolf was still alive, that she hadn't wasted precious minutes gathering supplies for a creature that had already slipped away into death. Because if this magnificent being died alone while she was running for bandages and herbs, Celine thought it might actually break something inside her that was already cracked and fragile from years of isolation and self-imposed exile. The clearing appeared ahead, and she could see the wolf still lying where she had left it, could see the shallow rise and fall of its breathing, and relief flooded through her so intensely that she felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and unexpected, because she realized with sudden clarity that she needed this wolf to live, needed to save this one life, needed to prove to herself that her touch wasn't poison, that her care wasn't fatal, that she could still do something good in this world, even if she had to do it alone and forgotten in the middle of nowhere. Celine dropped to her knees beside the wolf and began the careful, painstaking work of trying to save its life, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just whether this creature survived, but whether she could continue to survive herself, whether she could keep living with the weight of her supposed curse, whether she had any purpose left in this world beyond mere existence. And as the first snow of the season began to fall around them, dusting the wolf's silver fur with white flakes that looked like stars, Celine bent over her unexpected patient and whispered a prayer to a goddess who had never seemed to listen to her before, asking for just this one thing, just this one miracle, just this one chance to prove that her life, her gifts, her very existence meant something more than the curse everyone had always believed her to be. The night that followed was the longest of Celine's life. stretching out into an eternity of careful work and whispered prayers and desperate hope that refused to die. Even when the wolf's breathing became so shallow, she had to press her ear against its chest to hear the faint flutter of a heartbeat that seemed determined to stop entirely. And she found herself bargaining with the moon goddess in ways she hadn't done since she was a child, promising things she had no business promising, offering pieces of herself she couldn't afford to give. Because somewhere in the hours between sunset and midnight, this wolf had stopped being a stranger and had become something else entirely. Something precious. Something she needed to save more than she needed her next breath. She had cut away the matted fur around the wounds with trembling hands, her scissors making soft, snipping sounds that seemed obscenely loud in the heavy silence of her cabin, and the blood that had soaked into the magnificent silver-white coat had made her stomach twist with sympathetic pain, because these wounds were worse than she had initially thought, deep and ragged and clearly inflicted by something powerful enough to tear through muscle and sinew with terrifying ease. And she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out in shared agony as she cleaned each gash with boiled water and antiseptic herbs that she knew from experience would burn like fire against raw flesh. The wolf had remained conscious through it all, those extraordinary ice-blue eyes never leaving her face, watching her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead felt strangely comforting, as though the creature was trying to communicate something important, something she couldn't quite understand, but felt hovering just beyond her comprehension, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to be spoken. She had stitched the deepest wounds with careful, precise movements, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to make her vision blur at the edges, and she had counted each stitch aloud, 47 in total, her voice soft and rhythmic in the quiet cabin, creating a cadence that seemed to soothe both herself and her patient. And when she finally tied off the last stitch and sat back on her heels to survey her work, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the emotional weight of what she had just done, the responsibility she had just accepted, the life she was now fighting to preserve against odds that seemed overwhelming. The infection in the hind leg had been the worst part, hot and swollen and oozing a foul-smelling discharge that indicated the wound was at least a day old, possibly longer. And Celine had packed it with a poultice made from honey and garlic and comfrey root, ingredients her grandmother had sworn by for drawing out poison and promoting healing. And she had wrapped the leg in clean linen strips torn from one of her few spare blankets, sacrificing her own comfort without hesitation. Because what did it matter if she was cold when this magnificent creature was fighting for its life on her cabin floor? She had built up the fire until the small space was almost uncomfortably warm, until sweat was trickling down her back and making her wool sweater stick to her skin. Because hypothermia was as much a danger as the wounds themselves, and she had positioned the wolf as close to the flames as she dared, surrounding it with every blanket she owned until it looked like a mountain of fabric with just a silver-white head visible at one end. And still the creature shivered, its body trying desperately to regulate a temperature that kept wanting to plummet into the danger zone, where organs began to shut down and death became inevitable. Somewhere around 2 a.m, when exhaustion was making her bones feel like they were made of lead and her eyelids kept trying to close despite her best efforts to stay awake and vigilant, Celine had made a decision that she knew was potentially dangerous, but felt necessary in a way she couldn't quite articulate. And she had lain down beside the wolf, curling her smaller body against its much larger frame, sharing her warmth in the most direct way possible. And she had felt the mate bond stir for the first time, a flutter of recognition deep in her chest that she didn't understand, that she attributed to exhaustion and stress, and the strange intimacy of caring for a dying creature through the darkest hours of the night. She had stroked the soft fur of the wolf's neck, her fingers gentle and soothing, and she had found herself talking, the words spilling out in a confession she never would have made if she'd believed the wolf could understand her. If she'd thought for even a moment that this creature was conscious enough to process human speech and remember what she was saying in the vulnerable hours before dawn when defenses crumbled, and truth had a way of emerging whether you wanted it to or not. "I had a mate once," she had whispered into the silver fur, her voice barely audible even in the quiet cabin, and saying the words aloud felt like opening an old wound that had never properly healed, that had merely scabbed over and festered beneath the surface, waiting for someone to press on it hard enough to make it bleed again. His name was Thomas Gray, and he was kind to me in a way that no one else in the Ashwood pack had ever been, because most of them looked at my silver hair and pale skin and saw an omen, a curse, something unnatural that didn't belong among normal wolves. But Thomas said he thought I was beautiful, that my appearance made me special rather than strange, and I was so desperate for acceptance, so hungry for someone to love me, that I believed him without question, without hesitation, without ever stopping to wonder if what we had was real or just convenience, because no one else would have him and no one else would have me. The wolf's breathing had steadied slightly as she spoke, as though the sound of her voice was somehow comforting, and Celine had taken that as encouragement to continue, to keep talking, to let the poison of 4 years of silence and isolation drain out of her in words that she had never spoken to anyone, because there had been no one to speak them to, no one who would listen without judgment, no one who would let her process her grief and guilt without trying to fix it or dismiss it or use it against her. We were mated for 3 years, and they were good years, happy years, or at least I thought they were. And I believed that I had finally found my place in the world, that I had finally proven that I wasn't cursed, that I could be loved and wanted and valued like anyone else. And then one morning, I woke up and Thomas was dead beside me, his body cold and still. His heart stopped in the night, for no reason that anyone could determine, and the pack healers said it was natural causes, a defect in his heart that no one had known about. But I could see the way people looked at me afterward, the way they whispered when I walked past, the way they started to avoid me as though death itself clung to my skin and might transfer to them if they got too close. The tears had come then, hot and unexpected, sliding down her cheeks and disappearing into the wolf's fur, and Celine had made no effort to stop them, had simply let herself cry for the first time in longer than she could remember, because she had learned that crying alone felt too much like giving up, like admitting defeat, but crying while holding another living creature, even if that creature couldn't understand or respond, felt different somehow, felt like grief rather than surrender, felt like processing pain rather than drowning in it. "They blamed me, you know," she had continued, her voice thick with tears but determined to finish the story now that she had started it, determined to speak the truth that had been locked inside her for so long it had become part of her identity, part of the foundation upon which she had built her understanding of herself and her place in the world. My uncle, Alpha Victor, he said that perhaps it would be best if I left the pack for a while, just until the scandal died down, just until people stopped associating me with Thomas's death, and I was so young and so scared and so convinced that maybe they were right. Maybe I was cursed. Maybe my very presence was dangerous to those around me. That I agreed without fighting, without demanding the investigation that might have revealed the truth, without standing up for myself, because I had never learned how to believe I was worth standing up for. The wolf had shifted slightly, moving its head to rest more fully against her leg, and the gesture had been so clearly intentional, so obviously meant to offer comfort, that Celine had felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she had built to protect herself from the pain of connection, from the agony of caring about someone who might leave or die or reject her. And she had wrapped her arms around the wolf's neck and buried her face in its fur and let herself sob with an abandon she hadn't permitted since the day she had walked out of Ashwood Pack territory and into the wilderness alone. "I've been out here for 4 years," she had finally managed to say when the worst of the crying had passed and she was left with that hollow, exhausted feeling that came after a good cry, the sense of being wrung out and empty, but somehow lighter, as though tears had weight and releasing them created space for something new. 4 years of surviving, but not really living. 4 years of telling myself that isolation was safety, that being alone meant I couldn't hurt anyone else, couldn't be the cause of anyone else's death, couldn't be blamed when the inevitable tragedy struck, because tragedy always seemed to find me, seemed to follow me like a shadow I couldn't escape, no matter how far I ran or how well I hid. And I'm so tired, so endlessly, bone-deep tired of being afraid, of being alone, of wondering if this is all my life will ever be, this endless cycle of survival without purpose, of existence without connection, of breathing and eating and sleeping, but never truly living, because living requires hope. And I gave up on hope so long ago, I can barely remember what it felt like. The confession had hung in the air between them, and Celine had felt simultaneously lighter and more vulnerable than she had in years, exposed in a way that should have been terrifying, but instead felt strangely liberating, because there was something about speaking truth into darkness, about admitting your deepest fears to a creature that couldn't judge you or use your words against you, that made those fears feel smaller, more manageable, less likely to consume you entirely. "Please don't die," she had whispered finally, her voice breaking on the last word, and it was both a prayer and a command, a desperate plea to the universe that this one thing, this one life, this one chance at redemption would not be taken from her the way everything else had been taken, the way Thomas had been taken, the way her pack and her family and her sense of belonging had all been stripped away until she was left with nothing but her own company and the slowly dying hope that someday, somehow, things might get better. "Please live. Please survive. Please let me save you, because if I can save you, then maybe I'm not cursed. Maybe I'm not poison. Maybe I'm not the harbinger of death that everyone always said I was. And maybe, just maybe, I can start to believe that I deserve to live too, that my existence has value, that I'm not just taking up space in a world that would be better off without me." She had fallen asleep like that, curled around the wolf, one hand resting on its side so she could feel the rise and fall of breathing, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that grew stronger as the night progressed. And when she had finally opened her eyes to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window, she had been overwhelmed with relief to find the wolf still breathing, still alive, still fighting, and she had checked the wounds with hands that trembled from exhaustion and residual fear, and she had been amazed to discover that they looked better, that the angry redness around the stitches had faded, that the infection in the leg seemed to be responding to treatment, that this magnificent creature was going to survive after all, despite the odds, despite her curse, despite everything. She had offered water, and the wolf had drunk weakly, had offered raw meat from one of her rabbits, and the wolf had eaten a little, and Celine had felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time in so long it was almost painful. Because if this wolf lived, if her care and her skill and her desperate determination had been enough to save a life rather than end one, then maybe everything she believed about herself was wrong. Maybe she could start to rebuild something from the ashes of her old life. Maybe she wasn't doomed to eternal isolation after all. The sound that shattered her fragile hope came just as the sun was climbing over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost offensively beautiful, given the tension that suddenly flooded through her body, like ice water in her veins. Because the sound was unmistakable to anyone who had lived among wolves. The coordinated movement of many feet, the disciplined approach of trained warriors, the deliberate surrounding of her cabin by what could only be a large pack operating with military precision. Celine's heart began to pound so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, and she moved to the window on trembling legs, pulling aside the rough curtain she had made from an old blanket. And what she saw made her blood run cold and her breath catch in her throat, because there were wolves everywhere, dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, all massive and clearly elite warriors, all positioned in a perfect circle around her tiny cabin, all facing outward as though protecting something precious, and at the front, closest to her door, stood 12 wolves that were even larger than the rest, their formation precise and military, their bearing radiating authority and power, and every single one of them had silver-white fur that gleamed in the morning sunlight like precious metal, like something too beautiful and too dangerous to be entirely real. She turned to look at the wolf she had spent all night saving, the wolf that was now watching her with those intelligent ice-blue eyes. An understanding crashed over her like a wave, cold and devastating and impossible to deny, because she suddenly knew with absolute certainty that the creature on her floor wasn't just any wolf, wasn't just some random pack member who had gotten unlucky in a fight with a bear, but someone important, someone powerful, someone whose disappearance had mobilized an entire army to search through the night, someone whose life mattered in ways that hers never had, and the thought of what that might mean, of what consequences might follow from her decision to help, of what these warriors might do when they found their missing pack member in the cabin of a rogue Omega, with no protection and no rights, and a reputation as a cursed harbinger of death, made her knees go weak and her vision blur at the edges. The knock on her door, when it came, was firm and authoritative and utterly terrifying, and Celine realized with a clarity that bordered on panic that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to predict, that the isolation she had both craved and despised was about to be shattered forever, and that the wolf she had saved, the magnificent creature she had poured her heart and soul and skill into preserving through the darkest hours of the night, might turn out to be either her salvation or her final destruction, and she had no way of knowing which, until she opened that door and faced whatever waited on the other side. Celine's hand trembled as it reached for the door handle, her fingers hovering just inches from the rough wood that separated her from whatever fate awaited on the other side, and she found herself frozen in a moment of pure terror that felt like it stretched out into eternity, because once she opened that door, once she faced the army of elite warriors who had surrounded her cabin with such terrifying precision, there would be no going back, no pretending that last night had been anything other than a turning point that would define the rest of her life in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Behind her, She could hear the wolf beginning to shift, could hear the distinctive sounds of bones cracking and reforming, of a body reshaping itself from animal to human, and she knew, without looking, that whoever this creature was, whatever position of power and authority he held that would warrant such a massive search party, he was about to reveal himself, and she would finally understand exactly what kind of trouble her compassion had brought down upon her head, what price she would be asked to pay for the simple act of refusing to let another living being die alone in the cold and the dark. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and a voice called out with military formality that somehow managed to sound both respectful and commanding, a voice that belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are Selene Ashwood, and we know you are inside, and we have come for our king, who we have tracked to this location through scent markers and magical tracking that cannot be fooled or misdirected. So please open the door and allow us to verify his condition and safety, because we mean you no harm if you have offered him no harm. But we will break down this door and take him by force if necessary, though we would prefer to avoid such unpleasantness if possible." The words hit Selene like physical blows, each one driving home the impossibility of her situation, because king, the voice had said king, which meant the wolf she had saved wasn't just important, wasn't just powerful, wasn't just someone with connections and resources, but was royalty, was the leader of what must be one of the great packs, was someone whose life held value beyond anything she could comprehend, and she had touched him, had cut away his fur, had stitched his wounds, had lain beside him through the night, sharing warmth and confessing her deepest secrets, as though he were nothing more than an injured animal who couldn't understand or remember her words. "Let them in," came a voice from behind her, deep and rough with pain and exhaustion, but carrying an unmistakable note of command that made her body want to obey before her mind had even processed the instruction. And Selene turned to see that the wolf had completed his transformation and was now sitting upright, despite what must have been agonizing pain from the wounds that were still fresh and held together only by her careful stitching. And the man before her was the most magnificent creature she had ever seen in her entire life, tall even while sitting down, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of kingdoms, and silver hair that fell to his shoulders in waves that caught the morning light and seemed to glow with the same metallic sheen as her own, and ice-blue eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through to her soul, like he knew every secret she had ever kept, like he had heard every word she had whispered in the darkness, and was now waiting to see what she would do with the knowledge that he had been conscious and aware through all of it. She opened the door with nerveless fingers and stepped back as 12 massive men entered her tiny cabin, all of them dressed in identical silver-gray uniforms that somehow materialized during their shift from wolf to human, some kind of magic she didn't understand. And they moved with synchronized precision that spoke of years of training and absolute trust in one another. And they immediately dropped to one knee when they saw their king sitting there bandaged and clearly injured but alive, and the relief on their faces was so profound that Selene felt her own eyes begin to burn with sympathetic tears, because these men loved their king, would die for him without hesitation, had probably spent the entire night in terror that they had lost him, and seeing him alive had broken through their military discipline enough to show the raw emotion underneath. The man who had knocked stepped forward, older than the others, with silver hair liberally streaked with gray, and a face marked by scars that told stories of battles survived and prices paid, and he addressed the king with a voice that shook despite his obvious attempt to maintain composure. Your Majesty, we have been searching for you through the night, ever since you failed to return from your reconnaissance mission at the appointed time, and we feared the worst. Feared that the bear that attacked you had done more damage than you could recover from. Feared that we would find your body rather than you alive, and I cannot express the depth of our relief at finding you here. Wounded, but alive, and clearly well cared for by this Omega, who we will, of course, reward handsomely for her service to the crown. The king, because apparently Selene had spent the night saving and confessing her deepest secrets to actual royalty, which was somehow both better and worse than any scenario she had imagined, raised one hand in a gesture that immediately silenced the older warrior. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that came not from volume, but from the absolute certainty that he would be obeyed. Marcus, my most trusted captain and oldest friend, I need you to stand down and listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you, because it is important that you and the others understand the situation fully before we proceed any further. And I will not have this woman frightened or threatened or made to feel that she has done anything wrong when in fact she has done everything right, has saved my life when she had every reason to simply leave me to die in the forest, has cared for me with a skill and tenderness that speaks to both her healing knowledge and her generous heart. He paused, and his ice-blue eyes found Selena's violet-gray ones across the small space of her cabin, and she felt something pass between them, some recognition that went deeper than words, some connection that made her skin tingle and her heart race. And when he continued speaking, his gaze never left her face, as though the words were meant for her alone, even though the entire room could hear them. This woman is Selena Ashwood, formerly of the Ashwood Pack, and she found me yesterday evening on the verge of death from wounds inflicted during my battle with the bear, and she made the choice to help me despite the fact that I was a stranger, despite the danger to herself, despite the approaching darkness and dropping temperature, and she brought me to her cabin and spent the entire night treating my injuries with a skill that rivals our own royal healers, and she stayed awake to monitor my condition when she should have been sleeping, and she shared her warmth with me when I was in danger of hypothermia, and she spoke to me in the darkness, told me things that I suspect she has never told another living soul, showed me a vulnerability and honesty that was both heartbreaking and beautiful, and somewhere in those dark hours, I felt it, felt the mate bond snap into place with a certainty that cannot be questioned or denied, felt the moon goddess herself reaching down to show me that this woman, this brave and compassionate and utterly extraordinary woman, is my true mate, the other half of my soul, the partner I have been searching for through 6 long years of meeting eligible Omegas from every pack in 5 territories and finding none of them right because they were not her. The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that Selene could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could hear the crackle of the fire in the hearth, could hear the distant call of a bird outside the window, and she felt like the entire world had tilted sideways and she was falling through space with nothing to hold on to, because this couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of fever dream brought on by exhaustion and stress and the emotional intensity of the night she had just survived, because things like this didn't happen to cursed rogue Omegas who lived alone in the wilderness, because fairy tales about alpha kings claiming unexpected mates only existed in the stories that grandmothers told to young pups, because she was nobody, nothing, a cast-out wolf with a reputation as a harbinger of death. And he was a king, a leader of thousands, someone whose choice of mate would have political implications that rippled across territories. And there was no universe in which someone like him would choose someone like her, unless he was delirious from pain and blood loss, and didn't actually mean what he was saying. "No," she heard herself whisper, and then louder, with more conviction than she actually felt. "No, you don't know what you're saying. You're injured and confused, and probably still in shock from the trauma of nearly dying. And you think you feel the mate bond because I helped you, because I was there when you were vulnerable, because humans and wolves alike often form attachments to those who save them in moments of crisis. But it's not real. It can't be real, because I'm cursed, because my first mate died 3 days after we completed the bond, because everyone who gets close to me suffers for it, and I won't. I cannot. I absolutely refuse to be responsible for the death of a king, for the loss that would devastate an entire pack, for the power vacuum that would destabilize territories and potentially lead to war. So thank you for the incredible honor of your offer. But I must decline, must ask you to leave, must insist that you forget you ever met me and go back to your kingdom and find a proper mate, someone worthy of you, someone who won't bring death and misfortune to everyone around her." The king, and Celine realized with a start that she didn't even know his name, that she had saved his life and confessed her soul to him, and felt something stir in her chest when their eyes met, but had never bothered to ask who he was, beyond the magnificent wolf bleeding on the forest floor, pushed himself to his feet with visible effort, waving away Marcus when the older warrior moved to help him, and he crossed the small space between them with steps that were steady despite what must have been considerable pain. And he stood before her, so tall that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but absolutely firm, leaving no room for argument or doubt. "My name is Theron Silvercrest, and I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, which encompasses 53,000 wolves across 12 pack territories and 3 major cities. And I have been ruling alone since my parents were killed in a territorial dispute 6 years ago. And I have been searching for my mate for all of those 6 years, meeting hundreds of Omegas who were beautiful and accomplished and eager to be queen, and I rejected every single one of them because they were not you, because none of them made the mate bond sing in my chest the way it sang when you touched me, when you chose to save me, when you lay beside me in the darkness and showed me who you really are beneath the fear and the guilt and the belief that you are somehow cursed." He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to step away, and when she didn't move, couldn't move, was frozen in place by the intensity of his gaze and the absolute conviction in his voice, he took her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, Celine felt it. Felt the mate bond flare to life like lightning in her veins, like coming home after years of wandering, like finding something she hadn't even known she was missing. And she gasped at the intensity of it, at the rightness of it, at the way it seemed to fill up all the hollow spaces inside her that 4 years of isolation had carved out. "I have already sent investigators to your former pack," Theron continued, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture that was both soothing and possessive. "And they have discovered that your mate Thomas was murdered by rogues who were hired by a rival pack to destabilize the Ashwood pack's defenses, and his death was made to look like natural causes to avoid the retaliation that would have followed if the truth had been known. And your pack blamed you rather than admitting they had failed to protect one of their own, rather than acknowledging that their security was compromised, rather than facing the shame of having been infiltrated so completely that an assassin had walked among them undetected. So you were convenient. You were different. You were easy to blame. And they used your appearance and your grief against you to avoid taking responsibility for their own failures." The words hit Celine like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her knees go weak, and she would have fallen if Theron hadn't caught her. hadn't pulled her against his chest and held her with a strength that suggested he would never let her fall, never let her face the world's cruelty alone again. And she felt 4 years of guilt and self-blame crack open inside her chest, felt the poison of believing herself cursed drain away like water through cupped hands, felt the possibility of hope, of love, of a future she had never dared to imagine begin to take root in the spaces where fear and isolation had lived for so long. "You are not cursed," Theron said firmly, his voice resonating in his chest where her ear was pressed against him. "You are blessed. You are marked by the moon goddess herself, with that silver hair that matches mine, that marks us as a pair, as mates who were always meant to find each other, and your compassion, your inability to walk away from suffering, your willingness to risk yourself to save a stranger. Those are not weaknesses, but the greatest strengths a Luna could possess, because I need someone beside me who will lead with heart as well as head, who will see the wolves others overlook, who will fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, who will remind me that power is meaningless if it is not used in service of those who have none." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, and Celine saw her own hope and fear and desperate longing reflected in his ice-blue eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft but intense. "I am asking you, Celine Ashwood, to come with me, to give me 1 month to show you what your life could be, to let me prove that you are not cursed but blessed, that your gifts are needed and valued, that you have a place in this world, that you have a pack who will welcome you, that you have a mate who will spend the rest of his life showing you exactly how extraordinary you are. And if after 1 month you still want to return to this cabin, to this isolation, to this half-life of survival without connection, then I will bring you back myself and leave you in peace. But please, please give me a chance. Give us a chance. Give yourself a chance to see that everything you believed about yourself was a lie, told by people who were too small and too frightened to recognize the treasure they had in their midst." And standing there in her tiny cabin, with an alpha king holding her as though she were precious, with elite warriors watching with expressions that suggested they approved of their king's choice, with the mate bond humming between them like a living thing, with the possibility of hope and home and belonging shimmering before her like a mirage that might actually be real, Celine found herself nodding, found herself whispering yes, found herself taking the first step toward a future that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, found herself choosing to trust, to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the love that was being offered with such fierce conviction and gentle patience. The journey back to the capital took 3 days, and Celine spent those days learning to walk among a pack again, learning to accept kindness without waiting for the other shoe to drop, learning to see herself through Theron's eyes as someone worthy and valuable and extraordinary, rather than cursed and dangerous and broken. And by the time they reached the Silverstone city built into the mountainside, she had begun to believe that maybe fairy tales could come true for cursed rogue Omegas, that maybe the moon goddess had a plan all along, that maybe every moment of suffering and isolation had been leading her to exactly this place, to exactly this man, to exactly this future. The claiming ceremony was held under the full moon with thousands of witnesses, and when Theron marked her neck and the mate bond fully completed, a silver light exploded from their joined bodies and washed over the assembled crowd, healing old wounds and bringing blessings that people would talk about for generations. And Celine understood finally that her appearance, her gifts, her very existence had never been a curse, but a blessing. she had been too frightened and too broken to recognize, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a dying wolf that you choose to save, even when saving him might cost you everything, because the act of choosing compassion over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair, is what transforms curses into blessings and makes queens out of cast-out omegas who dared to believe they might deserve love after all. If you enjoyed Selene and Theron's story of second chances and fated mates, of curses that were really blessings and isolation that led to destiny, then please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale of alpha kings and extraordinary omegas, of rejection that becomes redirection, and suffering that becomes strength. Because every story I share is a reminder that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how cursed you believe yourself to be, no matter how alone you think you are in this world, there is always hope for transformation, always possibility for love, always a chance that the next knock on your door might be destiny arriving to show you that everything you believed about yourself was wrong, and that your true story, your real story, your best story, is just beginning to be written. So hit that notification bell and leave a comment telling me what you thought of how Selene's compassion saved not just a king, but herself, and what other stories of werewolf romance and fated destiny you would like to see explored. Because your support and engagement means everything and helps me continue creating these tales of transformation and hope and love that conquers all obstacles. And I will see you in the next story, where we will explore more alpha kings and rejected mates, and the magical bonds that tie souls together across time and space and circumstance. Because in the world of werewolves, love is always fated, destiny is always waiting, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to save a dying wolf, and in doing so, save yourself.